I got directed to a posting of a speech from Greg Benson talking about how inconsistent non-believers act. A lot of straw man ahead, so if you have any allergies, you might want to take your decongestants now.
It is not a mark of rationality for a person to assert one thing and then live contrary to that assertion. That might be considered a kind of moral hypocrisy, but equally it can be seen as a kind of irrationality. The unbeliever has one belief that he's using when he linguistically asserts his position, but then he has a conflicting belief evident when he behaves in a way contrary to what he asserted previously.
Oh goody, I'm about to be told how I think and behave. Let's see what he's got planned. I'm sure none of this will be stereotypes that he'll apply to all believers and non-believers.
So, when people live contrary to what they say, they are being moral hypocrites, but they're also being irrational. They have an inconsistency in what they believe or what is evident about their beliefs. And the life of the unbeliever, it turns out, is riddled with just such inconsistencies. Let me give you some examples quickly. An unbeliever will presuppose human dignity and attend the funeral of a dead friend, honor a relative who has passed away. And yet, at the same time, the unbeliever is known to have argued previously that man is, in principle, no different from any other product of evolution, like a horse or a dog.
Okay, let's start off with the basics. On a biological level, yeah, we are no different from animals. Yes, our brains process information in a different, and some would say better way, and we can make complex plans ahead of time, but from a biological and chemical standpoint, we are animals. However, on a social level, the level that most of us operate at, people put value onto other humans. We evolved brains that were complex enough to understand that humans are ambulatory bags of mostly oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. But we also evolved the need to work together. Humans are social creatures that do better when supporting one another. Now, we evolved the ability to have emotional connections to one another to help solidify that bond. It's easier for a group to work together and trust one another when they have an emotional connection to the others in that group. This is basic natural selection at work. Groups that do better because they have an emotional connection will surpass groups that don't.
Now, social events like funerals or solemn events where Christians don't want to make asses of themselves.
Yeah. Christians would always respect the solemnness of a funeral and never disrupt one with their own agenda. Never. Oh, sorry, you were saying?
Now, social events like funerals or solemn events where Christians don't want to make asses of themselves by doing this, but hypothetically, I've often thought when I've gone to a funeral, especially when unbelievers are going through all this stuff about human dignity and so forth and so on, how wonderful this person is, I say, what are we doing here at this funeral?
Oh, classy. We're above all this, but wouldn't it be fun to be cruel to others line? If you really want to do something like that, you're a jerk. If you want to do it, but refrain only because you're afraid you'll make an ass of yourself, you're a cowardly jerk. I'm going to throw this out, but what you may not get is that what these people are doing at these funerals you want to secretly disrupt is saying goodbye to someone they most likely cared about.
We don't have funerals for dogs. Well, some people in Southern California do, but they're considered weirdos. We don't have funerals for horses, for aardvarks and cockroaches. Why are we having a funeral for this particular part of the evolutionary chain?
The reason that most people have funerals for other humans, more often than for animals, is that people have very strong emotional attachments to the other people in their lives. We were bred through natural selection to care about others close to us. The offshoot of that is a profound sadness when they're taken from our lives. We know that we'll be upset when our family members are gone, so we try to prevent that from happening as long as possible. When the death of a loved one does occur, that sadness occurs too. That's why we have funerals, to have a chance to remember and say goodbye to the ones we love, and hopefully get some kind of closure to help us move on with our lives.
See, on the one hand, the unbeliever says man is nothing but advanced protoplasm, just the slime that's evolved. And yet he doesn't treat him like slime or her like slime.
No. While our ancestors were simple, single-celled organisms, the collection of which would be the slime you're referring to, we have evolved beyond simply that. We are able to understand and connect with those in the world around us on both an intellectual and emotional level. We as a species have grown beyond what we once were billions of years ago. Single-celled organisms, surprisingly, did not have much empathy with others of their kind. What we were has no bearing on what we are now in regards to how we treat one another.
When the death takes place, it's a kind of irrationality.
Losing a loved one and being upset with that is not an irrationality. The person that we had an emotional connection to is now gone, and we will never get that person back, at least if you don't believe in an afterlife. In fact, we could turn that around and claim that it would be irrational for anyone who believes in an afterlife that's supposedly better than the life on Earth to ever be upset about losing a loved one. On a practical level, those who believe in an afterlife should be thinking, the person I love, since they believe the right thing, completed the right rituals, or let the correct Savior into their heart, is in a better place. Soon I'll be with them for eternity. They're doing great. This should be a celebration. It should only be a solemn affair if you think, like most unbelievers, that the deceased are gone permanently. To act upset that your loved one is in heaven, where, after at most a few decades, you will spend eternity with them would be, how could we put this?
That might be considered a kind of moral hypocrisy. But equally, it can be seen as a kind of irrationality.
Yeah, that's one way to describe it.
The unbeliever will insist that man is nothing more than a complex of biochemical factors that are controlled by the laws of physics. And then the unbeliever who has argued all day that way in the science lab or in the lecture hall at the university goes home and kisses his wife and children and says he loves them.
Well, yeah. You ever spend an entire day at a lab just doing research? It's a long, boring, monotonous slog to update our knowledge of the universe. No wonder anybody doing that is thankful to get home to their loved ones. In the immortal words of my science advisor, while doing science is great, doing proper research sucks.
Man is nothing more but biochemical reactions controlled by the laws of physics, and yet he acts like there's something more, something above biochemical responses when he kisses his wife and says he loves her.
No. I know the feeling that I have for my wife is my brain flooding with various biochemicals like dopamine and oxytocin whenever I think of her. There we go. Knowing what is causing that feeling of love in me in no way deters from the sensation of euphoria I get when I think of her. There is nothing supernatural or otherworldly about it. My wife and I have an emotional bond that makes us happy together. Our emotional feelings at the most basic level may be nothing more than chemical reactions in the brain. But taking away their mystery and understanding what causes them doesn't make them feel any different. I feel love just the same way you do. I just have an understanding of what causes that feeling. And understanding what it is doesn't mute that feeling at all. To paraphrase the bard, when I inhale near a rose, the knowledge of the workings of an aromatic chain of complex hydrocarbons would smell as sweet.
The unbeliever will argue that in sexual relations, anything goes. There are no moral absolutes.
These are two different points, but he wraps them up as if they're the same thing. Yes, there are no moral absolutes. Nothing in the universe tells us what's right and wrong. There are things that many of us agree on, but morality is not a fundamental aspect of the universe, like, say, gravity. That being said, there are limits on how far most people think sexual activity can go. As a member of the kink community, I have often come across several acronyms that describe acceptable behaviors. SSC, or Safe, Sane, and Consensual. RAC, or Risk-Aware Consensual Kink. CCC, Committed Compassionate Consent. And Personal Responsibility, Informed Consensual Kink, or prick. You may notice a running pattern in these. They all contain an understanding of consent. In other words, the anything goes mentality comes with an amendum, as long as both partners, or more accurately, all members involved, are consenting to it and no permanent harm is done. There have been members of the kink community who were kicked out and even had the authorities called on them because they felt that a power exchange relationship meant that gave them license to abuse their partners. Members of the kink community continually have to argue against this fictionalized account that consistently gets put up. This details abuse. And I have to correct you on another point. You seem to imply that all unbelievers You seem to believe that unbelievers are all sexual deviants open for anything. And the flip side seems to imply that all believers are all prudish, lights out, get it over with quick types. This isn't always the case. True. I can't argue against that. But I don't represent all unbelievers. This may surprise you, but we aren't all the same. Being an unbeliever doesn't mean that one is automatically going to be an open-minded and accepting person. I've met several atheists who are closed-minded bigots and think that everybody should conform to their views on sexuality and gender. On the other hand, some of the kinkiest people in our community were believers. One couple even planned out their playtime so the sub would end up, let's say, sore on their backside Saturday night. So when they went to Mass the next morning, the continued rising and sitting on the hard pews would be a reminder of the session the night before. Different people can come from different walks of life.
And then the same unbeliever who says anything goes will turn around and condemn the war in Vietnam as an absolute moral atrocity. Excuse me? Isn't there something wrong with this argument? When it comes to shacking up with my girlfriend, anything goes. When it comes to the United States getting its pleasure by beating up South Vietnamese, that's not okay.
Yes, but the difference is that invading a country and killing each other is not really an event that all parties normally consent to. The difference between two people, as you put it, shacking up, and one army attacking another and the resulting carnage is that one is a consensual agreement and the other is somewhat lacking consent and does irreparable harm. Hopefully, I don't need to explain which is which. It's the war one. That's the one that involves harming others. Oh, and another aside, do you really think the whole point of the Vietnam War, or any other major conflict, is simply that one country gets pleasure from attacking another? I'm not a huge fan of war, but I understand that it's sometimes necessary, and I would hope that the reason soldiers get sent to die is more than politicians just getting pleasure from harming others.
Once you say anything goes, guess what? Anything goes. You can't turn around and be a moral absolutist then. The unbeliever will indignantly condemn child molesters, even though he said you can get your sexual pleasure any way you wish.
Again, sexual openness is not the everything goes straw man you claim it to be. Almost everybody is against acts that cause harm that are not consented to. Children under the age of consent can't consent. That's kind of redundant. And molesting a child does harm to them. That's why even people who are fairly open-minded sexually will condemn child molesters.
Well, of course, I think child molestation is horrible. I think it's a capital offense. There's no doubt about my negativity about it, but I can make sense of what I'm saying when I condemn child molestation. The unbeliever cannot.
Yes, I can. I live my life by the harm principle. If an action does harm without any corresponding good, then I condemn it. I don't want harm to come to me. And since I have the empathy my species evolved, I don't want unnecessary harm to come to others as well. This doesn't mean that nobody will ever harm anybody else. Sometimes harm is necessary. But we should all do our part to reduce any unnecessary harm in the world.